welcome to this great facility. Salt Lake County extends their welcome to this lecture. And myself, I work for Emergency Services, and my name is Mike Barrett. I am a 25-year contractor and a building official, so I live with a lot of inner conflict. And so I've been on both sides of this counter, but what you're going to hear today is super important. It's great to have you here. Again, Salt Lake County Emergency Management and Emergency Services extends their welcome. And I would like to turn the time over to Brent Maxfield, and who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Mike. On behalf of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Utah chapter, we welcome you also to this lecture. We're co-sponsoring with Salt Lake County Emergency Management. Appreciate their help in getting this venue organized. It's a beautiful facility. First time I've been able to come out here and visit it, and boy, I love it. It's great. I just want to make a plug for the chapter. We are dedicated to trying to reduce seismic risk in Utah. And we need all sorts of different groups to do that. We've got a lot of engineers that are members of the organization. We're seeking for others who have a common interest as us. And you can help us to try and reduce the risk that we have of earthquakes along the Wasatch Front. In relation to that, there's also a notice here about a scenario project that we're working on for a magnitude 7 earthquake on the Salt Lake segment of the Wasatch Fault. That's a big event, and it's going to be a big deal. And we're trying to paint the picture of what that life will be like afterwards, and some of the issues that we need to be thinking about now to make that event much more less than it would be if we don't get prepared. So I'm going to turn the time over now to Chris Pankow, who is going to introduce David Wald, our speaker.
It's my pleasure to introduce David Wald. I've worked with him now for many years. He's going to tell you about some of the great things he's developed at USGS for getting out information about what earthquakes do in terms of ground motions, the impact they have, and how we can relate these to people. And he's a great speaker, so you're going to be glad you came.
I've been a member of EERI for 25 years, and this is part of a lecture series that EERI has sponsored. And it's a really important community because it allowed me as a seismologist to interact with not only the engineering community, the built environment, but also emergency responders, planners, social scientists, and a lot of different entities that really drive the products that we deliver here. It's aimed at people like you responding to earthquakes and interacting with the built environment. So that opportunity through the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute has been huge. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues here, like Chris, Walter, Harabaz, the folks, Jim Penchman at the University of Utah Seismographic Station. That interaction with the US Geological Survey and the Advanced National Seismic System has been really critical over the last decades to establish a very, very real and credible seismic network here in the state and a really functional system. And I really want to acknowledge those guys. And everything I present today is work with colleagues at the US Geological Survey in Golden, Colorado, but also in other offices around the country. And so this has really been quite a group effort. The folks at the seismographic station spend a lot of nights awake when earthquakes happen. And I can relate to that because we have an issue here of thinking about what's next in Utah, what's next in the Salt Lake area, but from the National Earthquake Information Center, we're thinking about what's next around the globe. And when you think, if you close your eyes and you think about where the next big earthquake disaster is going to be, you've got to put together a couple of ingredients. And the ingredients are a seismic hazard, a strong shaking somewhere, a large area that shakes hard, a population center. Typically, large populations and shaking leads to disasters. But then you have the built environment. And that third ingredient is very important, and it's very difficult to get our hands on. So let's take a look at this problem. So when I look around the world and I think of the earthquake problem, Salt Lake has got serious issues. But there's places around the world that have more serious issues. And one of the issues is buildings out there. If you look at this slide, this is a colleague of mine, Robin Spence at Cambridge University, and he put together a slide, and I modified it, which has effectively the percentage of unsafe buildings for different countries around the world. And some countries like Iran and India have percentages of unsafe structures that are about 90%, almost all of the structures there. Now this is determined by asking questionnaires to engineers in each country in a survey, okay? And the ranges are pretty extraordinary. If we look at California, we look at the central and eastern US, Canada didn't actually respond, then we have much lower percentage of the structures that are collapse possible. So this is a pretty interesting slide, and the range of unsafe buildings is interesting to look at. But this is a survey of in-country engineers, and it looks like China actually should be quite a bit higher, so this is not completely reliable. But the bigger question is, why did Robin Spence ask engineers in countries about the structures in each country? And the answer is, we don't know. We don't have, for most countries, the kinds of building inventories that we need to do either rapid assessment of structures or quick response, or to do planning for the future about reducing risk. So he had to ask and get expert opinions on this. And I'll come back to how we answered this question through the course of doing the studies that we have to understand how to respond to earthquakes around the globe. Now, one of the things I wanted to start with is to say that in Utah, in Salt Lake City in particular, there's been a huge number of very successful efforts in the direction of mitigation, response, monitoring, science, and I really need to acknowledge that because these are big efforts, and over the long term, these will pay off. The response capabilities, the engineering changes, the retrofits, the school inspections, everything is going to contribute to the future. That said, bad stuff's still going to happen, and that's where we come in. We're talking about how to mitigate the losses from rapid response and rapid information after earthquakes. And so the place that I'll be going today is a series of systems that we've developed in order to rapidly respond to earthquake. You'll see that they can also be used for mitigation purposes. But the main systems that I've been responsible for are shown here, and they include the Did You Feel It system, the Shake Map system, the ShakeCast system, and the Pager system. Did You Feel It is a public service. It's internet users coming in, filling out a questionnaire very quickly after an earthquake, and we can put that into a map form and look at the intensities of the earthquakes. How many people have ever done Did You Feel It in this area? Okay, so we've got, that was about 10% of the audience. After a significant earthquake, about 1% of the population actually comes in and fills out a questionnaire. So that's a pretty good, you guys are slightly biased towards being aware of the earthquake information. The Shake Map system is a shaking distribution that's based on seismic instruments in the ground. In Utah, that's the Seismographic Station network that is run out of the university collaboratively with the USGS, and that is constrained by the seismic instruments. Those two systems feed the loss systems that we have, ShakeCast and Pager. And those two systems are very different. ShakeCast is for specific users to look at their facilities after an earthquake and say, what are our inspection priorities? It takes the Shake Map as the input and it looks at those facilities and says, what's the likelihood that this needs inspection or is damaged? The Pager system for prompt assessment of global earthquakes is more of a global system in terms of the overall impact to the society that's affected by an earthquake, and it is in terms of the fatalities that are likely to have occurred, as well as the economic impact. But in a gross sense, the ShakeCast system is geared towards specific structures, the Pager system is geared towards the overall population. So we'll talk a little bit about what's under the hood in these systems. There's quite a bit of science behind these. We'll gloss over some of the details, but keep in mind that these systems are a combination of the hazard and then the losses that result from the hazard. And as I talk about these, we'll cover a very important aspect, and that is the underlying users. Why are we doing it? What's the motivation? Who uses it and how do they use it? I'll be touching on a few of those examples as we go along. These are just examples, these are logos from examples. There's a whole range of different other users are out there, but I just put these up for kind of demonstration purposes. On the left is the Did You Feel It reports, little presenting areas that we average the responses over for the questionnaires that basically say, did you feel it and what effect did you notice and was there any damage? These two are on the same color scale, but they're completely independent of each other. There's no information from this map on this map. One is on the left from the citizen scientists out there responding to earthquakes, and on the right is from the seismographic instruments in the ground. And the color scale here is the intensity scale. It's the intensity of shaking and the likelihood of damage to particular types of structures if they experience that shaking. So the shake map system is driven by the underlying seismic stations. They're shown as triangles in our maps, and they're given color coding according to the level of shaking as shown on the particular map here. If we zoom in a little bit, what we do is we make different maps for different users. There's a KML for Google Earth, and for GIS users, there's a variety of different flavors that we produce, and those are all available online immediately after an earthquake for a variety of different uses. Now, one of the keys about the whole shake map system is that if you have enough stations in the ground, if you have a seismic network that's robust and widely distributed, the map will give you the answer right away. If you don't have significant seismic stations in the ground, we'll estimate the shaking, but it'll get better as you go over time. You can see this map barely changes because we had a lot of seismic instruments in the ground. We got a few more later on in 15-minute and 6-hour range, but overall the picture hasn't changed much. You'll see as we go around the world, we don't have the luxury of seismic instrumentation like we have here in Salt Lake, in California, and a few other parts of the US. So what we do in some places, including California, is we use those Did You Feel It data to help inform the shaking of the shake map. We would prefer to have instruments in the ground everywhere, but we have to take advantage of what we can when we're trying to characterize earthquakes very quickly. For instance, on the East Coast, we had a magnitude 5.8 earthquake in 2011, and there are only 2 instruments on the map that were available in real time. So effectively what we had is knowledge from what the citizen scientists came in with, and there was over 140,000 entries that allowed us to make this really nice detailed map of the shaking intensity. But again, we'd rather have lots of instruments in the ground to constrain this quickly and more accurately. The amazing thing about the Did You Feel It system is it turns out to be pretty robust and is very quick. These are 1-minute snapshots. Every change of the image is a minute, and we get about 1,000 responses per minute for this particular earthquake. So that's 1,000 people filling out questionnaires and entering them per minute. So that's 15 or so per second. And so over a course of a half hour, an hour, or 2 hours, you get a pretty good image of what's going on in terms of the shaking level. And there was minor damage in the epicentral region, but significant in the epicentral region, minor damage in the surrounding areas, but it added up to a couple $100 million worth of losses. So if we zoom in on that particular epicentral region, the Did You Feel It system allows us to have a quick assessment of the shaking based on the citizen science. The shake map in that case, since there were no instruments, is a bullseye. We don't know exactly what the shaking variations are, so we estimate it, and our estimation is approximate, but it gets kind of the overall picture, but not the details that you get from Did You Feel It. So we've developed the capability to allow that Did You Feel It data to inform the shake map, and this then goes out to the different users, as we'll see. Now, I won't get into the details here, but effectively, this is an earthquake magnitude 7.6 in Costa Rica. The shaking is shown in contours of what we call a ground acceleration, the acceleration with respect to gravity. And what we do with the shake map system is we predict the shaking at all points on the grid, all points on the map, even though we don't have stations everywhere. If we don't have any stations, we'll still make an estimate of the shaking. And for the engineers and seismologists in the room, there's a very important way of combining what we get from the felt reports and the seismic stations with estimates of shaking in order to get the best shake map possible. And that's something that we do with the equations that we will be having a quiz at the end on, but don't worry about it. So another thing that we need to know in terms of the shaking is the underlying geology. And we do that, and it's pretty well known in Salt Lake after a lot of geotechnical analyses. But around the world, we have to make approximations. And we do make approximations based on the topography of the region and the slope. Very flat areas have softer sediments. Very steep areas tend to be rock. And we can make those assumptions and inferences to help inform what the shaking would be in different places near the epicenter. Now, around the globe, when we make estimates of shaking for very large earthquakes, we have some bigger challenges. If we don't have stations everywhere, then our first map could be that bullseye, very, very simple. Over time, we add what we call the finite fault. The fault plane in this rectangle here is the area of the fault that slipped. And if you're near the fault that slips, you're going to have stronger shaking than you will in areas further away. So determining that fault is very, very important to do very quickly if you don't have enough stations in the ground to capture that. And this last image is what happens when we, 3 days later, get the instruments that were available from the University of Costa Rica and allowed us to get really an accurate picture. You can see how it's evolved. And our initial estimate is sound uncertain. We actually capture the uncertainties, and the engineering and the loss community want to know how uncertain the shaking is, and so we characterize that. And one of the consistencies that we strive for is to have the same products made everywhere in the world. University of Utah generates a shake map, and the same output comes out of that system as we generate in Golden and as generated in other systems in other nations in the world. So users around the globe can use the same products and be sure they're going to get the same formats no matter where the earthquake is. And this is key, and it's allowed varieties of users in different realms, in the media, response, aid agencies, to use the same system for informing their post-earthquake response. One of the challenges that we face around the globe, and it will be true here in Utah as well, is determining what fault ruptured and quickly doing that. And we've spent some effort in trying to understand that problem and to determine this black line in this case, which is the fault that ruptured for a magnitude 6 earthquake, a magnitude 7 earthquake. So you can barely see the magnitude 6 earthquake fault for Napa Valley, maybe 10 miles long. You go to a magnitude 7 earthquake, it's 100 miles long, and then you get to a magnitude 8 earthquake and it can be a couple hundred miles long. We try to determine that because the shaking is going to be strongest along that fault. If this these are on the same scale, by the way, so this is the shake map for the magnitude 6 that we saw, and this is a magnitude 8. We expect something more like a magnitude 7 on the frontal faults here in Salt Lake. But if this rupture started at the epicenter and ruptured along this Denali fault in this direction, the shaking pattern would be completely different, and so we're trying to capture that very, very quickly. Again, we can do this 2 ways. We can have instruments in the ground. In Southern California, we have lots of instruments, and if this faulting was through this instrument cluster, then we'd understand the shaking pattern right away. But south of the border, we don't have any instruments, and so we have to establish the shaking from estimating what this fault dimension is through seismological tricks that we play. So we're sort of opportunistic. We try to get the fault, we try to get any shaking intensities that are reported, and we try to get whatever seismic instruments in the ground to make the best shaking estimates. This is a magnitude 8.8 earthquake that happened back in 2010. The entire southern half of South America was shaken, and you can see the reports of intensities across South America. Zooming in on Chile, it was felt throughout, very strongly throughout Chile, and we established this fault that dips beneath Chile and is the source of the strongest shaking. And between the fault and the estimates of shaking that we got from the Did You Feel It system, we make a shake map that is pretty well constrained and shows rather strong shaking across most of central Chile. In Salt Lake, this is a magnitude 3.3 that happened last year. There's a very good distribution of stations in the urban areas. So we expect to be able to capture the shaking from a large earthquake. Whether or not it's on a northern extent of the faulting system or a southern extent, we should capture that very quickly with these stations. And yet, let's see, we haven't seen that yet, but you can see the density of stations along the urban corridor is substantial enough to capture the shaking pattern very quickly for this particularly small earthquake, but we'll be able to do the same for larger earthquakes when they happen. So the Did You Feel It system domestically informs us of other things. We can look at the response over a 15-year period. What was felt around the country from earthquakes in all parts of the nation. I've left off Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii for now, but the pattern that we see from shaking over 15 years doesn't represent what's going to happen in the future. It's only a small snapshot in time, and yet it's pretty informative. These are almost over 3 million responses that have come in that 15-year time period. So it gets a good picture of where the hotspots are with some significant exceptions. if you look in Utah, and if you look in places like Oregon and Washington, and even the San Andreas Fault, which is through California, there's not a lot of strong shaking in the last 15 years. The earthquakes are rupturing at a longer return time, and so we haven't captured that in that short time period. And what we expect to see over a longer time period is of course, these faults being activated over the decades and centuries. So if we look very closely, for instance, right here in Salt Lake, we look back at what is experienced so far, it's really not representative of what we will see down the road when these faults rupture. So that's a bit of a challenge to try to keep informed and keep aware of the earthquake problem when we have such limited background seismicity. One thing we can do with the combination of the shake map system and the DigiField system is to look at a longer time period. This is 100 years now, 112 years, and we start to include earthquakes like the 1934 event north of the city, and you start to see the pattern that emerges. If you had a longer image of the earthquake history, you'll start to see the faults that aren't active, but by the century. So this is a really nice way to go back in time, but this is about how far we can go back before we run out of information about past earthquakes. So shake map uses. This is a kind of a favorite slide of mine. Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was governor of California, looking at a shake map, trying to explain it to the Los Angeles community. He probably did a better job than I'm doing. Looking at this from an emergency response perspective, this is the LA Emergency Management Center, a base isolated structure as well, really nice facility. And this is the primary plan that we had for shake map, is for response purposes. But it's really important to plan for earthquakes. And so over the years, and here in Utah in particular, a number of groups have used the shake map as a planning tool for earthquake scenarios. So what could happen in the future and how will we respond? And so that's been a vital direction as well. And using the National Seismic Hazard Map, we can also determine what areas are likely to have earthquakes in the future. And in the case of Salt Lake, we'll see what the impact of this kind of earthquake would be if we had the scenario. But other places around the country are obviously interested in planning and doing drills based on this shake map approach to mapping out the seismic hazard. Lastly, and this is very key now, is the shake map is the shaking hazard, and it becomes an input into loss estimation. Over the years, it's become a very useful tool, and as I mentioned, ShakeCast and Pager do that, but FEMA uses the HAZUS tool, which is Hazards US, it's a loss estimation tool for the United States. It's not applicable outside the United States, so this is one reason why we respond with the Pager system. It uses shake maps as an input to estimate the losses. It's not available in real time, and so it's key to have something as a placeholder before FEMA gets into the loss analysis. HAZUS was developed for long-term planning and for doing scenarios and what-if cases like that. So let's talk a little bit about the ShakeCast system. So ShakeCast, it's software that we have. It's open source software. People run it on their individual in-house hardware or now in the cloud. And they basically load up the inventory of overpasses or bridges, hospitals, any kind of critical facility. And what happens is it automatically reports the nature of the likely inspection priority or damage to each of those structures in a hierarchical view so that the group that's responsible for those structures can respond quickly. So it's there for the immediate aftermath of an earthquake to prioritize things. Once the ground truth information comes in and all the flybys and all the reports come in, then you'll be going to a different set of observations, the ground truth. But in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake, groups like the California Department of Transportation, UDOT, and others that have a lot of facilities can prioritize response using the system, and it's completely automatic from end to end. The shake map runs through the system, and you get this report automatically, which allows you to look at the facilities that affect your response. And that's the way we've done that for the ShakeCast system. So this report gets automatically attached, as well as whatever you'd like a spreadsheet of the facilities that are affected. And this is an example for the Department of Veterans Affairs. There are hospitals where for a small earthquake in California, they get a list of the shaking levels at each hospital and the likelihood of needing inspections. I mentioned California Department of Transportation. This is their system. Other utilities like the Southern California Edison, which has an enormous number of dams spread out through California, can now get an analysis of those dams and the inspection priorities automatically. And a critical user is also the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, who, believe it or not, needs to know our best estimate of shaking at nuclear power plants around the world. They're not a regulatory body, they're advisory, so they do not get shaking information other than volunteered information at nuclear power plants around the world. So it's a pretty critical system for a number of critical facilities, both domestically and globally. And effectively, the ShakeCast system is a big database where it takes the shake map in and it looks at the shaking levels at the different overpasses or bridges or hospitals and then reports that information through the internet and through cell phones and email. One thing that's been really nice is users that expect shaking, so if you're a critical user in Salt Lake or in San Francisco or Los Angeles, it's probably good to have this running remotely. And so cloud technology has allowed us to hand the software over to folks to run it in the cloud, so it's run remotely, and it's also run in a redundant form. And for us, it's been really important because keeping the software going on different users' infrastructure has always been difficult because of firewalls and because of special software intricacies that may have, that are on local systems. So the cloud, the ShakeCast system has been working, and it's a nice way to build a remote system that's independent of the shaking that happens at a particular location. The challenge with any kind of loss estimate quickly is trying to understand how that structure will respond when the shaking occurs. So a lot of engineering work is done to try to understand what, given a different shaking level, what the likelihood of damage is, whether it's green, yellow, orange, or red in terms of the likely impact to structures. Luckily, the bridge community, the engineering and Department of Transportations around the country have built a database over the years that has all the information that's needed to do the quick estimate of whether that shaking is going to cause damage. Unfortunately, that's not true of most of the other structures that we have around the country and around the world. And these inventories are fundamental to be able to not only respond, but also to plan for likely disasters that come down the road. We got a nice note from Caltrans. This is a report that Lauren Turner, a structural engineer, bridge engineer at Caltrans, put out after that recent Napa earthquake. And it shows how Caltrans used the report that came out of their ShakeCast system to set up inspection priorities. And so this report goes to hundreds of Caltrans inspectors, but they have tens of thousands of overpasses. So they have to prioritize who goes where after a significant earthquake. The Napa earthquake was only a magnitude 6. Magnitude 7, magnitude 7.5 earthquake would shake 10,000 overpasses in California. What we found with the ShakeCast system is that a number of different kind of critical users discovered that this would make a lot of sense for their response protocols. And so we have some users like the LA Unified School District, which has 750,000 students or so. Corporate America, Target, Walmart, they both have the ShakeCast system in order to respond to earthquakes anywhere in the world that affect their communities. And so we're starting to see take up in different user sectors in addition to the critical lifeline facilities that we were aiming for when we first developed it. In Colorado, we have and we record thousands of earthquakes a year, and we're trying to determine which ones are significant in terms of humanitarian interest and response for a lot of the users that we send notifications to. So we have literally thousands of earthquakes around the year. We're trying to pick out which ones would be green, yellow, orange, red, which ones would be no impact, low impact, significant impact, and kind of an international crisis. And so that's the nature of the pager systems, to pull out the earthquakes that are going to be strongly affecting the communities. So we've developed a system that takes the shake map system, and so we have earthquake information, shaking, and that goes into what we call a module that effectively represents how we estimate losses. I won't get into the details. Typically this talk is for structural engineers, and we talk about the details of the underlying systems, but I can show you how it works because we can get away with estimating losses even though we don't know in-country specifics about the structures. We can look at past earthquakes and get a good assessment of what's happened in each country based on the shake map and estimate what would happen if a similar earthquake or a different earthquake happens. So we have a system that, again, I won't get into the details here, that we look back in time and we look at historic earthquakes where we can make shake maps. We look at the losses that occurred during those earthquakes, whether they're financial or fatalities, and we can start to calibrate the system around the globe. The way we do this is we start to look at the population that was exposed to different intensities at the time of the earthquake. So we go back in time, we make a shake map, and we look at the particular shaking for each intensity level, and we count the population at that intensity level. Now, it turns out if you have earthquakes where the losses are known or estimated, you can then calibrate for a given population and a given shaking level, what would you expect in terms of fatalities. These earthquakes on the right are all magnitude 7 or so earthquakes, and the outcomes were extremely different. 2 fatalities for the Baja earthquake, no fatalities in New Zealand. There was an aftershock of that New Zealand earthquake that was in Christchurch that did have fatalities, but this one had no fatalities. And then a Haiti earthquake magnitude 7 as well, 230,000 fatalities. Can we pull out this information very quickly? Well, yes, we can. And we do that by going back in time and looking at earthquakes all around the world. We've got about 6,000 events where we've made these shake maps, and we know what's happened from past earthquakes. One of the important things that we talked about in bringing in the intensity data from the reports of Did You Feel It, as well as the seismic stations, also allows us to go back in time where we didn't have seismic instruments, but we have happened seismic intensities. So whether or not we have lots of instruments in the ground for the Chichi earthquake in 1999, I got the wrong date on there, the Chichi earthquake in Taiwan, or back in 1977 when we only have intensities, we can make shaking estimates and look at the losses from those earthquakes. We then take the population, compare it to the losses in the shaking level, and what we come up with is, and I'll skip over this, curves that tell us for a given shaking level what we expect the fraction of the population to be killed in that particular country. So this is a bit of a, well, this is a bit of a downer. This is a real serious indictment of bad buildings. In California and New Zealand, for instance, the chance of dying in a strongly shaken area of an earthquake is about 10,000 times lower than the chance of dying in Iran or Pakistan. It's all about structures. In developing countries that don't have code or don't build a code, the fatality rates are thousands of times greater than they are domestically. And that's what we face in terms of loss estimates. But for each of these curves, we can then go back and say, if an earthquake happens here, we count up the population, look at the shaking level in each population, and we can estimate losses. There's an analogous way of doing that for economic losses. You look at for that earthquake, and you do not the population exposure, but the economic exposure for that particular earthquake. And we use data from the UN in terms of gross domestic product per capita. If we wanted to estimate the losses from earthquakes by using knowledge of the structures, and we can do that domestically, we need to know, first of all, we have to define what structures are out there. We have to then count the number of structures per country or per area or per zip code, per census tract. We have to know, given a what each structure will do in terms of response. Will it be damaged? Will it collapse? Will it be will it cause fatalities? That knowledge is very hard to come by, as is the inventory. But another challenge comes up, and that is, Given a collapse, how many people will perish? And that depends very much on the structure type. You could imagine a wood frame building collapsing, an adobe building collapsing, or reinforced collapsing. It causes very different fatalities, and that has to be established. It's not well established. There's another challenge, and that earthquake happens in a given time of day in a particular location, how many people are in the structure. That is a huge challenge in terms of bookkeeping of who's where and when. So you can imagine if you wanted to have a model that knows everything about the inventory, the buildings, how they respond, and who's where and when, there's going to be some uncertainties involved. We can do that in parts of the U.S. You know that in Utah there's been a lot of work in trying to determine what the inventories of schools are, what the nature of the structures are, but imagine that problem around the world. It's a huge challenge. And one of the things we've done through ERI is to get together experts to determine how structures behave given a particular shaking level so that we can better do this loss estimates in real time. And I'm going to skip over this as well. So imagine trying to figure out who's where and when during an earthquake. This is how we do it in the background of the pager system. And we have to determine who's working inside, who's commuting, who's residential, who's in the workforce, who's commercial, and these challenges are things that add to our uncertainty in the loss estimates. I'm going to skip over this given the nature of the audience. The nice thing about having an estimate of structures in each country is if there is a disaster, we can now say with some uncertainty what structures are going to dominate the fatalities, what structures are going to collapse the most, and if they collapse, are going to kill the most people. For different countries, it's very different. For the Chilean earthquake, we can see the distribution of structures that were damaged, and these are in concrete and dressed stone. But in Haiti, the dominant structure was a concrete block structure. Now, most of the structures that collapsed were concrete blocks, but almost all the fatalities were from these structures because when they collapse, they're extremely deadly because they collapse almost 100% and they're very heavy. So with a knowledge of the structures in the country, we can now tell urban search and rescue teams before they leave the country what the dominant structures are in terms of collapses and likely fatalities. And that's been an advancement that's well needed. Lastly, I want to talk about how do we report fatalities. This is a pretty sensitive issue. If we have an estimate, it's always going to be uncertain. But you could see that with the different ranges of vulnerabilities with structures, the different populations and different shaking, we can come in a reasonable place in terms of the losses. But how are we going to communicate the likelihood of fatalities? It's obviously a sensitive issue. So we've looked at this problem. We've come up with a way of representing the need for response or the critical nature of the earthquake based on the number of fatalities in a green, yellow, orange, and red category. And we can then have an alert based on the most likely range of those fatalities. But we can also show how likely it is to be in adjacent ranges of fatalities. So this is 1, 10, 100 fatalities, up to 1,000 fatalities for a red alert. We've basically tied this into what we would consider no response necessarily, a regional response, a natural response, and an international response. And so this alerting now is effectively more useful than just putting out a magnitude and location because magnitude and location alone doesn't tell you the likelihood of these impacts. And this is the key to the pager system. We have also in parallel an alert that is based on the economic impact. So the Napa Valley earthquake, for instance, or the DC earthquake that I showed didn't have any fatalities. There was a belated fatality in the Napa Valley, but it was close to $1 billion worth of losses. So having both an alert that's based on the economic impact as well as the fatalities is useful for domestic earthquakes. For earthquakes in developing countries, unfortunately, it's the fatalities that drive the response, and that's something that we can now estimate. But most earthquakes, like I said, around the globe are going to be green alerts. Even though they're of significant magnitude, we can rest assured that there's not going to be a significant impact if there's not a vulnerable population exposed to that shaking. And that happens quite a bit. One of the benefits of this system is to say when things aren't bad and there's no response necessary. In the case of this magnitude 7.6 Costa Rica earthquake, that's a large earthquake in a populated area that has potentially vulnerable structures in a lot of areas. So the pager system puts out this one-page report. It's based on the alert level, which is the higher of the fatality estimate and the economic losses. We can send people only yellow alerts or only orange alerts and higher, depending on what they're interested in. And we put in a lot of other information on the page that tells about the structures, about, again, the range of likely fatalities and economic losses, and information about the population at each shaking level. So this information is all put there and sent out to critical users within 10 to 15 minutes of an earthquake. It's very important for moderate-sized earthquakes where it's not so clear, magnitude 6, 6.2 earthquake, it's not so clear what the impact's going to be. And again, it depends on where it is and what the population is. In this case, two magnitude 6, 6.2, 6.4 earthquakes in Iran and China, both extremely vulnerable countries in terms of buildings, one in a very remote populated area and one in a densely populated area. And the outcome, we had alerted a yellow impact for economic losses and an orange impact for fatalities. It turned out to be pretty close, and unfortunately in this case we had several hundred fatalities for this moderate-sized earthquake in Iran because of the population and vulnerability of structures. Domestically, we send out these alerts to a number of critical responders in the US, including FEMA, and a number of different emergency management organizations. For the case of the Napa earthquake, it was a red alert in terms of economic impact. We don't know exactly how much the losses were from the Napa earthquake, but we think it's in the $500 million range. For the mineral earthquake in Virginia, we had sent out an orange alert, and it turned out to be pretty close, and it was about $200 million worth of damage from that particular earthquake. A lot of that damage isn't obvious from an emergency response perspective or from in the case of Virginia, FEMA's perspective. There wasn't that much to see, but things like the National Cathedral, the Washington Monument, and a lot of damage to structures internally added up and was discovered over the weeks that followed the earthquake. What about Salt Lake? Well, we can run through some of the scenarios that have been developed here at the university and in collaboration with a number of different agencies. We can run that through the pager system as if it happened sometime in the future or given today's population exposure and economic exposure. And we find some rather distressing numbers. I think it's dangerous to compare any individual scenario with any other losses or estimates from these. And the system that we're running here is very generalized. It's not as specific as the HAZIS work that's been done to estimate losses, but nonetheless, I think the ranges that it provides in terms of potentially hundreds of fatalities for this particular magnitude 7 scenario and tens to even $100 billion worth of damage is quite reasonable given the uncertainty in what goes into estimating these losses. If we move that fault a little bit further northward, we have a very different story in terms of the population exposure. And so what exactly happens after a major earthquake is going to be very dependent on the exact rupture dimensions, what the fault is with respect to the population, and a number of other factors. And we just chose magnitude 7. It could be magnitude 7.1, it could be 6.8, it could be a variety of different things that would change the outcomes. But we think this is a reasonable view of what might happen down the road here in Salt Lake. Time frame of minutes for the magnitude and location. As soon as the magnitude and location come out, felt reports start coming in, and we start doing the shake map and the pager results and shakecast system that depend on the shake map system will be there right there afterwards. Around the country, here in Salt Lake, in California, there's enough stations that you can get a magnitude location very quickly. As we go around the world, everything shifts. We need to get readings on enough instruments to get a good location and magnitude. In some places around the world, that'll take more time than it will where we have lots of instruments. So where does this information go? A number of you get this information directly. It all goes on websites. Everything we produce is openly available through the earthquake notification system and the online systems, and for instance, Shakecast. Anyone can operate that system, and a number of different groups do. It is important to practice this. I think that's a great thing about the scenarios is you can go find the information, find different paths to the different web pages that you might want to go to, including the University of Utah's pages as well as the USGS pages for trying to have redundant paths after an earthquake. But you need to practice that. You need to find these. Most of the time you can just Google things and find them. You don't, you can do it by just getting the right buzzwords, but you need to practice that. The information goes to a lot of people directly. We send out several hundred different alerts in terms of the pager information. It goes online, like I said, it's available to everyone, but it goes and gets alerted to specific users, including Craig Fugit at FEMA, the director of FEMA. Some of you know Doug Bausch from FEMA. I work with him quite a bit. He's in the Denver area, and we get together after any earthquake and collaborate on loss estimates. Doug sent me a note a couple months back and said, when you send that FEMA alert to the National Watch Office, National Natural Watch Center, NWC, here's where it goes. So we send this to several hundred users, but then it gets redistributed. And the recipients here represent the domestic agencies that are responsible for a disaster. And some of them are really obvious, the FAA, the Northcom, and National Defense, but you'd be amazed at the number of people that use this for immediate decision making after an earthquake. One of the things that we do, and an important aspect of my work, is the underlying science that goes into the system, and we do open up all that information to others to use, and we've learned a lot in building the system, but there's always a lot more to do, and in fact, one of the issues with regard to earthquakes here in Salt Lake in particular is landslides and liquefaction. One of the things that we don't do is estimate losses due to landslides and liquefactions. Everything right now is based on shaking. So there's some room for improvement, but that's very difficult to do on a global scale. In the magnitude 7.9 Wenchuan earthquake, right along the frontal faults by the city, 20,000 people were killed by landslides out of the 87,000 fatalities. So that's something that we're trying to better accommodate. It's a very steep mountainous region on the frontal fault. And what we can do with the shake map system is to go back and say, given the shaking and given what we know about the topography and what has been mapped out in terms of landslides, there's tens of thousands of landslides in that particular earthquake, and they just cover the landscape. Can we develop a system that will be predictive in terms of not only the shaking, but the likely landsliding and liquefactions? And we've got a prototype system, and this is work in progress, which allows us to estimate where the landsliding and liquefaction is going to occur. But the impact of that is still something that's beyond our grasp. And there's a number of different researchers and colleagues that are working on these problems to better implement that into a real-time system. So you can see there's a lot of work in progress. And you can see how all these pieces fit together in terms of the shaking and the impact and trying to bring that into play into real time. But the uncertainties associated with that are certainly very large, all room for improvement. And I just close with acknowledging some of the people that have been key players in these systems, and most of these are colleagues at the USGS, but we have got a lot of support from colleagues around the nation, around the world, as well as the regional networks that run the seismic operations here in Utah, California, Pacific Northwest, Hawaii, and other regions. And those collaborations have been really key. And I do want to mention that we have science in terms of postdocs, undergraduates, graduate students, all sorts of colleagues around the world, and I just mentioned a few that have been working with us recently. And lastly, those that want to know the underlying science, there's a lot of pieces that are still in work in progress, and we're we're going to be touching on these through the external grant program and through the different science that we do at the USGS and through the collaborations with colleagues like those here at the university. So with that, I will thank you. In Utah and other regional seismic network web pages, and as they're looking for information, very prominently is, did you feel it reported here? And so we kind of use that as a reverse and collaborative effort where you're looking for information, but we end up getting information as well. So if you just Google USGS earthquake, you will find that link very, very quickly. And again, it's very fortunate that we don't have to spread the word because people are looking for information right after an earthquake. And Mother Nature gets people's attention, so it's sort of felt by a lot of people. We get a good fraction of those people actually reporting it. It's a little difficult to quantify exactly what Utah has because we haven't seen the losses. We have building inventories. Building inventories aren't perfect, and our understanding of how those buildings respond isn't perfect. So there's considerable uncertainties in making these inferences. What we know in California and New Zealand, we've grouped those together because even there we don't have that many earthquakes to calibrate this against. We know that in Salt Lake City, for instance, the number of unreinforced masonry residences and commercial structures makes it significantly more vulnerable than some of the like-minded cities around the West. California is a whole other country in a sense that the building code and the nature of earthquakes being so common has allowed for a much less vulnerable infrastructure and built environment. But Salt Lake is most likely significantly above average in terms of the western U.S. In comparison to cities of like size because of the dominance of particularly unreinforced masonry structures. Yeah, so the question is again how to implement ShakeCast rather. There's some level of sophistication required in terms of investing time and energy into getting that inventory into the system. The USGS we support this, and the system is evolving. And right now we're developing a really nice template, which is just a spreadsheet that allows you to fill in the spreadsheet in terms of an inventory, select the most likely candidate in terms of structures from the hazards lookup table, and it exports that into the format that is digested by the ShakeCast system. So we're facilitating that, but it's still a little bit of work to get there, and yet we have some help in the USGS to give you feedback if you get stuck in a particular aspect of that problem.
Sounds like a great way to get that in. How many facilities in Utah are using the ShakeCast currently? It sounds like a lot of them outside of Utah, but how many within the state are using it?
Chris is giving me a number. The Department of Transportation has been working on this for some time. The state as well. Chris, there's a couple other, so some individual cities. There are other groups that have a national footprint that are obviously using it, like Walmart and others that have a footprint that's in Utah, that have a larger footprint in general. But to be honest, it has spread out of California. The earthquake awareness and the kind of ubiquitous nature of emergency response in each organization allows that to have larger uptake. But and the system is relatively new, so it's good to see that there's some critical users here, and I think that'll probably expand as well over time.
What about utility?
In terms of using ShakeCast? Well, there's a pretty wide variety of utilities in California. In Utah, the uptake, I think we've interacted with a number of utilities. It takes a little time to get your inventory together and to understand the structural response. In California, the Division of Dam Safety, a number of different private and public utilities, Santa Clara utilities, East Bay Metropolitan Utility District, a number of different groups are coming on board in terms of using that. And I should mention that one of the challenges that a lot of utilities have is not just prioritizing and understanding damage, but the regulatory framework. So both the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the International Atomic Energy Agency They need to know when certain inspection criteria are met, and the Division of Dam Safety in California has to inspect dams when a particular shaking level occurs. So they need to know the shaking level, and this is another way of combining the shaking estimate and the location of a facility to say, do we need to inspect this based on the regulatory framework? And that's something that we built into the ShakeCast system to answer those particular questions. There are a few data sets domestically that are in pretty good shape. One of them is Department of Transportation and bridges. The other one is dams, and the Army Corps of Engineers and the National Inventory of Dams is in pretty good shape. So I think it's relatively straightforward to go from that inventory to a ShakeCast, usable system without all that much difficulty, because the structures are, their location and their nature is known. Again, approximately, nothing's set in stone. So Bureau of Rec and Army Corps and a few other federal agencies would be, well suited to come on board, because the structures are engineered. They know, to some degree what is in place. But there's a lot of dams and a lot of bridges that need to be characterized. So it'll take some doing. Yeah, that's a great question. How do we engage and particularly the media in terms of communicating what we already have online and provide? It's a challenge. We put out, I think, very good content, but how it gets digested is always beyond our control. We have to keep working on that message, and I think you guys attending here and trying to pass that on is important. But that media communications is always sensational and difficult to provide. To be educational is always a challenge from the scientific perspective.
Large Japanese earthquake that might give some sense of what to expect if there were a big earthquake in the LA basin or here along the Wasatch Front, in terms of anticipating, let's say, internet failure.
Internet, the phone, and other communications. And it's not in great shape. And so we will have failures. Some of the alternatives to investing in that infrastructure is to have some kind of standby and backup. And so the USGS National Earthquake Information Center in Golden is meant as a backup for any systems that are in place in areas that are going to be strongly shaken. That said, I hope things don't fail, but we have to have Plan B for critical infrastructure going down during a significant earthquake.
So my question is, on the pager product, with that being produced in a matter of a few minutes, what kind of post-processing do you do before it's handed to the USAR or the media? Is there any, the product just goes immediately, and also is there a soft interface with the HAZIS modeling team and Doug on what they're coming up with at some point before you do?
Yeah, good questions. Regards to how does the information flow from the pager system in our interaction with the FEMA for the HAZIS runs. First, the latter question, after an earthquake, I work with HAZIS FEMA directly to ensure that the shake map product that they're going to run through the losses is most up to date and stable, and it takes several hours to run the HAZIS software for a significant urban area. So we try to coordinate that and make sure we're on the same page. As far as the pager alerts, that's a great question. Green alerts go out end-to-end automatically, after our analysts review the earthquake and say that earthquake information is sound. Yellow alerts go out automatically, but if it's an orange or red alert, we send out information saying there's been this significant earthquake and the alert is pending. So we send out the information automatically, and then we review that information, and we can sit on the alert for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and we are waiting for confirmation of the depth and the magnitude from systems that take more time, that basically are collecting more data from further stations than the initial stations. And so the red and orange alerts are embargoed initially, and they will take a little longer, maybe 10 to 15 minutes longer than the automatic system. And we do that just from experience, that we don't want to send out information. Most of our users would rather have that information more accurate than sooner. And that's a classic trade-off in this business between speed and accuracy.